The Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with frenetic energy on that late March afternoon in 2025. The air was thick with the mingled scents of jet fuel, overpriced coffee, and the faint tang of nervous sweat from travelers darting between gates. Amid the chaos, Marcus Washington stood out like a beacon of calm, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that hugged his frame just right. His polished leather carry-on hung casually from one hand, its weathered edges hinting at years of use, while a corner of his pilot's license peeked out from a side pocket, unnoticed by the hurried crowd. Marcus adjusted his grip on the bag, his dark eyes scanning the first-class boarding line ahead, with a quiet confidence born from years in the cockpit. Today, though, he wasn't flying the plane. He was just a passenger, looking forward to a rare moment of rest on the journey from Atlanta to Seattle. As he approached the gate, the clamor of rolling suitcases and muffled announcements faded into the background. At the front of the line stood Jessica Carter, a flight attendant with platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her crisp navy uniform accentuating her rigid posture. Her blue eyes narrowed as they landed on Marcus, a flicker of something cold passing through them. Disdain, perhaps, or suspicion. Her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line as he stepped forward, boarding pass in hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice dripping with a sarcasm that made the word sir sound like an insult. "Are you sure you're in the right line? Economy boarding is that way." She waved a manicured hand vaguely toward the crowded gate next door, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Marcus met her gaze steadily, his expression unreadable, and handed over his boarding pass without a word. The subtle rustle of paper against her nails filled the tense silence as she snatched it from him. Jessica's eyes darted over the pass, widening for a split second before hardening into a scowl. "I see," she muttered curtly, thrusting it back at him with enough force to make it flutter slightly. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Washington." Her tone was clipped, but as Marcus moved past her toward the jet bridge, he caught her low, venomous whisper. "Guess they're letting anyone into first class these days." His shoulders tensed for a fraction of a second, the words slicing through the air like a blade. But he didn't turn back. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Behind him, the gate area stirred faintly, a ripple of unease among the onlookers. An older woman with silver hair, Evelyn Harper, clutched her phone tightly, her fingers hovering over the record button as she watched the exchange with a furrowed brow. She leaned toward her husband, whispering something Marcus couldn't hear, her eyes never leaving Jessica's smug figure. Marcus stepped onto the jet bridge, the hollow clang of his shoes against the metal walkway echoing in time with his steady breaths. The faint hum of the aircraft's engines greeted him like an old friend, a sound that had carried him through countless hours aloft. He shook off the sting of Jessica's words, letting them dissolve into the background noise of the bustling terminal behind him. He wasn't here to fight petty battles. He was here to relax, to sink into the plush comfort of a first-class seat and let someone else take the controls for once. Yet as he entered the cabin, the familiar sense of belonging washed over him, tinged with a quiet ache. Beyond the locked cockpit door at the front lay a world he knew better than most, a world where he'd proven himself time and again against doubters who wore smiles as sharp as Jessica's. He found his seat, 3A, a window spot near the front, and stowed his bag in the overhead bin with practiced ease. The leather creaked softly as he settled in, the cushion molding to his frame like a well-worn glove. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the low rumble of the plane's systems ground him, but he couldn't ignore the prickling sensation of eyes on him. A quick glance confirmed it. A businessman in a crisp suit 2 rows ahead shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting away when Marcus caught it. A young mother across the aisle adjusted her toddler's blanket, her expression curious but guarded. Marcus exhaled slowly, turning his attention to the window where ground crew scurried beneath the plane's belly, their orange vests glowing in the afternoon light. He'd faced those looks before, some subtle, some blatant, but they never stopped feeling like pinpricks against his skin. Back at the gate, the tension Jessica had ignited hadn't dissipated. Evelyn Harper, still clutching her phone, pressed record as Jessica turned to her colleagues with a smirk. "Can you believe it?" she muttered, loud enough for nearby ears to catch. "First class isn't what it used to be." A young attendant with kind brown eyes, Daniel Morales, his name tag read, frowned, his jaw tightening as he leaned toward a coworker. "That was uncalled for," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the din. The woman beside him, a seasoned attendant with a tight ponytail, shrugged nervously. "Stay out of it, Dan. You know how she gets." A few feet away, two male crew members exchanged smirks, one stifling a laugh with a cough when Jessica shot them a look. Evelyn's camera captured it all, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a growing resolve to document the injustice unfolding before her. As Marcus sat in his seat, oblivious to the brewing storm behind him, the plane taxied toward the runway, its engines roaring to life. Whatever lay ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be anything but routine. The plane climbed steadily into the sky above Atlanta, its engines humming a deep, resonant tune that vibrated through the cabin. Marcus Washington leaned back in his first-class seat, the soft leather cradling him as he watched the city shrink into a patchwork of lights through the window. For a moment, he let himself exhale, a rare pause from the relentless pace of his life as a pilot. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a faint chime, signaling the start of in-flight service, and Marcus straightened slightly, sensing the shift in the cabin's rhythm. He wasn't naive. He knew what might be coming. The encounter with Jessica Carter at the gate had set a tone, and the air still carried the faint crackle of her disdain, like static before a storm. Jessica emerged from the galley, pushing a cart laden with drinks and snacks, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her demeanor transformed as she approached the first row of first-class passengers, an elderly couple with silver hair and gentle smiles. "Good afternoon," she cooed, her voice honeyed and warm, bending slightly to hear their requests. She poured their sparkling water with a delicate flourish, her smile widening as they thanked her. Marcus watched from the corner of his eye, his face a mask of calm, though his fingers tightened imperceptibly around the armrest. He'd seen this dance before, the exaggerated kindness for some, the pointed neglect for others. When Jessica reached his row, the warmth vanished like a light snuffed out. Without a word, she slapped a napkin onto his tray table, the motion so abrupt it nearly slid off the edge, then followed it with a plastic cup of water. The liquid sloshed over the rim, pooling in small, defiant droplets on the tray. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice steady and polite as he reached for the cup. Jessica's only response was a derisive snort, her lips curling as she turned away, not bothering to meet his gaze. The gesture was small but deliberate, a silent declaration of her contempt, and it hung in the air like a challenge. Across the aisle, the young mother from earlier shifted uncomfortably, her toddler squirming as she whispered something to him. The businessman 2 rows ahead kept his eyes glued to his laptop, but his shoulders stiffened, betraying his awareness. From further down the aisle, Daniel Morales, the young attendant with kind eyes, watched the exchange with a furrowed brow. He hesitated, his hand twitching toward the cart as if to intervene. But he stopped himself, casting Marcus an apologetic glance before turning back to his duties. The cabin pulsed with an unspoken tension, a current that Jessica seemed oblivious to, or perhaps reveled in, as she moved on, her cheerful mask slipping back into place for the next passenger. As Jessica glided down the aisle, her voice rang out with practiced charm, offering extra napkins and warm smiles to a well-dressed woman in her 50s, a few rows behind Marcus. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" she asked, her tone syrupy sweet, leaning in as if sharing a secret. The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Marcus before dropping to her lap. "No, thank you," she murmured, her voice tight. Jessica straightened, then lowered her voice just enough to ensure it carried. "I didn't realize they were handing out first-class seats in charity raffles now," she said, a smirk tugging at her lips as she nodded subtly in Marcus's direction. The words hit like a slap, sharp and deliberate, and Marcus nearly choked on the sip of water he'd just taken. He set the cup down with careful precision, his jaw clenching as he fought to keep his composure. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the engines suddenly louder in the stunned silence that followed. The woman Jessica had addressed gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest, but before she could respond, Jessica had already moved on, her heels clicking a triumphant rhythm. Marcus stared at the damp napkin on his tray, the water stains spreading like tiny accusations. He'd faced this before, On the ground, in simulators, even in the cockpit, whispers and sneers that questioned his right to be where he was. But up here, at 35,000 feet, with nowhere to escape, it felt different, raw. He took a deep breath, letting the steady drone of the plane anchor him, refusing to let her ignorance unravel him. Yet the weight of her words lingered, a spark waiting to ignite. Unbeknownst to Jessica, her barb had rippled beyond Marcus. Evelyn Harper, seated near the back of first class, tightened her grip on her phone, the video still rolling from the gate now capturing this fresh insult. Her silver eyebrows knitted together in quiet fury as she muttered to her husband, "That's disgraceful." In this day and age? Her husband nodded, his weathered hand squeezing hers, his own expression darkening. Daniel Morales, still hovering near the galley, winced visibly, his fists balling at his sides. He glanced at Marcus again, guilt flickering in his eyes, but he stayed silent, trapped between duty and discomfort. Even the businessman, who'd been studiously ignoring the scene, shifted in his seat, his fingers pausing over his keyboard, as if wrestling with whether to act. Jessica's voice carried on, bright and carefree, oblivious to the storm she'd stirred, or perhaps daring it to break. Marcus turned his gaze back to the window, the clouds streaking past in a blur, and steeled himself. He knew this wasn't the end of it. Her contempt was a fuse, and the cabin was already smoldering, ready for the whispers to erupt into something louder. The plane cruised smoothly at altitude, slicing through a sea of cotton-white clouds under a sky that stretched endlessly toward Seattle. Inside the first-class cabin, however, the air crackled with a tension thicker than the turbulence Marcus Washington had navigated in countless cockpits. Jessica Carter's venomous remark about charity raffle seats still echoed in his ears, a bitter aftertaste that lingered as he sat motionless in 3A, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. The water stains on his tray had dried into faint rings, a silent testament to her earlier disrespect. But Marcus kept his gaze fixed on the window, his reflection staring back at him. A man who'd fought too hard, too long, to let her unravel him now. Around him, the cabin buzzed with a low, restless energy, the kind that brews when people sense something wrong, but aren't sure how to name it. Evelyn Harper's voice broke the hush first, a soft murmur that carried further than she intended. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to her husband, George, her silver hair catching the overhead light as she leaned closer. "The way she spoke to that gentleman, it's shameful, George. Blatant prejudice, right here at 35,000 feet. George's weathered face creased with a troubled frown, his hand tightening around hers. "It's not right," he agreed, his voice gruff but low. "Someone ought to say something." Their words rippled outward, catching the ear of the young mother across the aisle, who'd been fussing with her toddler's blanket. She glanced at Marcus, then at Jessica, who was now refilling drinks with an exaggerated smile for a passenger near the front. "It's awful," she muttered to herself, barely audible, her fingers trembling as she adjusted her son's tiny headphones. The businessman, Richard Hensley, 2 rows ahead, couldn't pretend to ignore it any longer. His laptop screen glowed with spreadsheets, but his eyes flicked toward Marcus, then back to the keys, his fingers hovering as if frozen mid-thought. He'd seen the exchange, heard Jessica's barb, and the discomfort gnawed at him, a prickling guilt he tried to bury beneath his work. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under his weight, and cleared his throat as if to shake off the unease. Near the galley, Daniel Morales lingered, his kind brown eyes darting between Jessica and Marcus. He clutched a stack of napkins, his knuckles whitening as he wrestled with indecision. "She's out of line," he whispered to his colleague, the ponytailed attendant, who shot him a warning glance. "Don't stir the pot, Dan," she hissed. "You'll just make it worse." But Daniel's gaze lingered on Marcus, a silent apology in his eyes, as if he wanted to bridge the gap Jessica had carved between them. The cabin simmered, whispers weaving through the air like threads, pulling tighter with every passing second. Jessica moved back up the aisle, her cart rattling faintly as she handed out snacks with a mechanical grace, her smile a brittle mask that didn't reach her eyes. She paused by the well-dressed woman in her 50s, the one she'd mocked Marcus to earlier, and leaned in with a conspiratorial air. "Anything else for you, ma'am?" she asked, her voice dripping with saccharine charm. The woman's lips parted, then closed, her eyes darting to Marcus before settling on her hands. "No," she said quietly, almost a whisper, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf. Jessica's smirk widened, sensing her discomfort, and she straightened with a theatrical sigh. "Well, some people just don't know their place, do they?" she muttered loud enough for the nearby rows to catch every word, her gaze sliding toward Marcus like a dagger aimed to wound. The cabin seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy with the weight of her provocation. Marcus felt the sting, sharper this time, a hot flare of anger surging beneath his calm exterior. His hands curled into fists for a fleeting moment before he forced them open, pressing his palms flat against the armrests. He'd heard worse. God knows he had. But the brazenness of it, the way she wielded her prejudice like a weapon in this confined space, clawed at him. He turned his head slightly, catching her silhouette in his peripheral vision, and saw the smug tilt of her chin. She wanted a reaction, a crack in his armor, but he wouldn't give it to her. Not yet. Instead, he let his mind drift to the memory of his first solo flight, the exhilaration of the controls in his hands, the sky bending to his will. That was his truth, not her venom, and he clung to it like a lifeline. The whispers grew bolder now, a chorus of discontent weaving through the cabin. Evelyn's voice rose again, trembling with indignation. "In this day and age, I can't believe it," she said to George, her tone sharper, drawing nods from a couple seated nearby. "It's disgraceful." Richard Hensley finally looked up from his laptop, his jaw tightening as he met Marcus's eyes for a split second before glancing away, guilt etching lines into his face. He muttered something under his breath. Cowardice or condemnation, Marcus couldn't tell. Daniel Morales, still near the galley, took a tentative step forward, then stopped, his face a storm of frustration and fear. Evelyn's phone trembled in her hands as she kept recording, her resolve hardening with every frame. The tension pulsed like a living thing, coiling tighter, and Marcus sensed it. The spark Jessica had lit was catching, ready to flare into something bigger. Outside, the clouds thickened, a faint rumble of distant turbulence mirroring the unrest within, a prelude to the chaos that waited just beyond the horizon. The plane hummed along at cruising altitude, a deceptive calm settling over the first-class cabin as the tension from Jessica Carter's barbs simmered just beneath the surface. Marcus Washington sat in 3A, his eyes tracing the endless expanse of clouds beyond the window, their edges tinged with the golden glow of a setting sun. The low drone of the engines had almost lulled him into a moment of peace, a fragile respite from the hostility that had shadowed him since boarding. Around him, the whispers of discontent had faded into an uneasy quiet. Evelyn Harper's phone now rested in her lap. Richard Hensley's laptop glowed dimly, and Daniel Morales busied himself in the galley, casting occasional glances Marcus's way. It felt like the calm before a storm, though Marcus couldn't yet name the thunder he sensed brewing. Then it hit, a violent lurch that jolted the aircraft sideways as if an invisible hand had seized it mid-flight. Glasses clinked sharply on trays. The toddler across the aisle let out a startled wail, and Marcus's water cup tipped, spilling its remnants across his lap. The cabin erupted in gasps and muffled cries as the plane shuddered again, harder this time, the overhead bins rattling ominously. Marcus's hands gripped the armrests, his pilot instincts snapping awake. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. The vibrations were too erratic, too deep, a telltale sign of something mechanical clawing at the plane's stability. His heart thudded, not from fear, but from a surge of adrenaline that sharpened his senses, pulling him back to the countless emergencies he'd trained for. The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the rising panic with a voice strained and unsteady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot, Ryan Taylor," it announced, the words clipped and rushed. "We're experiencing a minor issue in the cockpit. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation." The message ended abruptly, leaving a void filled with worried murmurs. Marcus's brow furrowed. He caught the tremor in Ryan's tone, the faint edge of desperation that no passenger announcement could mask. Years in the cockpit had taught him to hear what wasn't said. This was no minor issue. His suspicion crystallized as a flight attendant burst from the galley, her face ashen, her hurried steps faltering as she reached Jessica and Daniel. She leaned in close, her voice a frantic hiss that carried in the tense quiet. The captain's collapsed. Heart attack, maybe. He's out cold. Ryan's alone up there, and he's losing it. We need to land. But this turbulence... She cut off, her hands trembling as she clutched the cart for support. Jessica's eyes widened, a flicker of shock breaking through her usual composure, while Daniel's face drained of color, his gaze snapping to Marcus as if drawn by instinct. The cabin tilted again, a sickening dip that drew screams from the back, and Marcus knew time was running out. The plane rocked again, a bone-rattling shudder that sent a tray clattering to the floor, its contents skittering across the aisle. Marcus Washington unbuckled his seatbelt with a swift, practiced motion, the click of the clasp drowned out by the rising chorus of panic from the passengers. His mind raced, calculating altitude, fuel, weather patterns, all the variables he'd mastered over a decade of flying. He stood, his tall frame steady despite the lurching cabin, and moved toward the cluster of flight attendants near the galley. Jessica Carter's shocked expression hardened into disbelief as he approached, while Daniel Morales' eyes widened with a glimmer of hope. The third attendant, a petite woman with a name tag reading Lydia, clutched her arms, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she stared at him. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos with a calm authority that silenced their frantic whispers. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm a pilot. Commercial. 12 years. I've handled emergencies like this. Let me help." The words hung in the air, a lifeline tossed into a sea of uncertainty. Lydia's mouth opened, then closed, her gaze darting to Jessica as if seeking permission. Jessica scoffed, her arms crossing tightly over her chest, her earlier disdain surging back like a reflex. "You?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to pierce the din. "A pilot? We're not desperate enough to trust an amateur in a real crisis." Her words dripped with venom, but they faltered as the plane dipped again, a sickening drop that drew a collective gasp from the cabin. Marcus met her stare, unflinching, his dark eyes steady as steel. "Every second we argue puts everyone on this plane at risk," he said, his tone low but unyielding. "I know what I'm doing. Do you?" The challenge landed like a blow, and Jessica's smirk wavered, her confidence cracking under the weight of the moment. Behind her, passengers began to stir, their voices rising in a ragged swell. "Let him help," Evelyn Harper called out, her silver hair disheveled as she gripped her husband's arm. "If he's a pilot, what are you waiting for?" Richard Hensley, his laptop forgotten, nodded grimly. "Do something before we all die." The urgency in their cries pierced the haze of Jessica's prejudice, and she hesitated, her lips trembling as she glanced at Daniel. Daniel didn't wait for her approval. He lunged for the intercom, his fingers fumbling with the button. "Co-pilot, this is Daniel from the cabin crew," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. "We've got a passenger who says he's an experienced pilot. Should we send him up?" A tense silence stretched, broken only by the creaking of the plane's frame, until Ryan's voice crackled back, raw with relief. "If he's got flight experience, send him now. I need help up here. Immediately." Daniel turned to Marcus, a flicker of trust in his eyes. "Let's go, sir." The first-class cabin of the Atlanta to Seattle flight had descended into a cacophony of fear, the air thick with the sharp gasps of passengers and the metallic groans of the plane as it battled relentless turbulence. Marcus Washington moved swiftly down the aisle, his broad shoulders cutting through the chaos like a ship through choppy waves, following Daniel Morales toward the cockpit. The plane lurched again, a violent twist that sent a scream rippling through the seats, and Marcus steadied himself against the wall, his pilot's instincts honed to razor sharpness. Behind him, Jessica Carter trailed reluctantly, her heels clicking unevenly, her face a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, and a flicker of doubt that gnawed at her earlier certainty. The passengers' voices rose in a desperate chorus, Evelyn Harper's among them, shouting, "Hurry! He's our only chance!" Their faith in him was a lifeline, pulling him forward through the haze of panic. Daniel reached the cockpit door, his trembling fingers fumbling with the security code as the plane shuddered beneath them. Come on, he muttered, sweat beading on his brow, until the lock clicked open with a soft beep. The door swung wide, revealing a scene of barely controlled chaos. Warning lights flashed red across the instrument panel, their staccato pulses painting the small space in an eerie glow. Co-pilot Ryan Taylor sat hunched in his seat, his hands white-knuckled on the controls, his face slick with perspiration. Beside him, the captain slumped lifelessly, his head lolling against the headrest, skin pale and clammy. A stark silhouette of a man felled mid-flight. "Thank God," Ryan breathed, his voice cracking as he glanced up at Marcus. Relief washing over him like a wave. "Are you the pilot?" Marcus nodded, stepping into the cockpit with the calm assurance of someone who'd faced the abyss before. "Marcus Washington, commercial pilot, 12 years, he said, his tone steady as he slid into the captain's seat. "What's our situation?" Ryan's words tumbled out in a rush, his eyes darting between Marcus and the blinking gauges. "Captain had a heart attack, out cold 10 minutes ago. I've been trying to stabilize us through this turbulence, but it's getting worse. Fuel's dropping fast, and I can't do it alone." The plane jolted again, a sickening dip that made the walls creak, and Marcus's hands moved instinctively to the yoke, his fingers curling around it with a familiarity that steadied his pulse. He scanned the instruments. Altitude 32,000 feet, airspeed fluctuating, weather radar showing a chaotic swirl of storms ahead. "All right," he said, his voice a low anchor in the storm. "First, we get out of this turbulence. Then we figure out where to land." Marcus's hands danced across the controls with a precision that belied the chaos around him, adjusting the throttle and easing the yoke to counter the plane's wild pitching. The cockpit felt alive, a beast bucking against his grip, but he knew its language, the subtle tremors, the faint whine of strained engines. Ryan Taylor watched, his breaths shallow, a mix of awe and desperation in his wide eyes as Marcus wrestled the aircraft back from the brink. "Climb to 34,000, Marcus commanded, his voice firm but calm. "We'll skirt the edge of this storm system. Should be smoother up there." Ryan nodded, fumbling with the altitude settings, his hands steadier now with Marcus's presence grounding him. The plane groaned as it ascended, the turbulence lessening slightly, a fragile reprieve that let the warning lights dim from frantic red to a cautious amber. Behind them, Jessica lingered in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly, her earlier skepticism warring with the undeniable reality unfolding before her. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, her lips a thin line as she watched Marcus's every move. Daniel stood beside her, his gaze fixed on Marcus with something bordering on reverence, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet resolve. The passengers' muffled cries filtered through the door, Evelyn Harper's voice rising above the rest. "He's doing it! Thank God!" And Jessica flinched, her smug facade cracking under the weight of their trust in the man she'd dismissed. Marcus didn't notice. His world had narrowed to the instruments, the sky, and the lives depending on him. He flipped on the radio, his voice cutting through the static with authority. "This is Flight 142, declaring an emergency. We've got an incapacitated captain and severe turbulence, requesting immediate clearance for an emergency landing." The response crackled back, tense but clear. "Flight 142, this is Seattle-Tacoma Tower. State your position and condition." Marcus relayed their coordinates, his eyes flicking to the fuel gauge. Lower than he'd like, but enough if they move fast. "Captain's down, possible heart attack. I'm a passenger pilot, taking control. We're stabilizing, but we need a runway now." A beat of silence followed, then, "Roger, Flight 142. You're cleared for emergency approach to Seattle-Tacoma. Runway 16L, emergency cruise on standby." Marcus exhaled, a tight knot in his chest loosening, but not unraveling. He turned to Ryan. "Prep for descent once we're clear of this mess. We've got 25 minutes to get on the ground." Ryan nodded, a flicker of confidence returning as he mirrored Marcus's calm. Jessica shifted, her heels scraping the floor, and Marcus caught her reflection in the cockpit glass. Pale, uncertain, a woman staring at the ruin of her assumptions. The plane steadied further, the storm's grip loosening, But Marcus knew the real test was still ahead, waiting in the cockpit where every decision would weigh 100 lives. The cockpit of Flight 142 was a crucible of flashing lights and taut silence, the air heavy with the metallic tang of adrenaline and the faint acrid scent of overheated electronics. Marcus Washington sat in the captain's seat, his hands steady on the yoke as the plane carved a path through the thinning edges of the storm. The turbulence had eased into a low, persistent rumble, but the warning lights still pulsed amber across the instrument panel, a constant reminder of the fragility holding them aloft. Beside him, Ryan Taylor adjusted his headset, his movements jerky but growing more assured under Marcus's unflinching calm. The unconscious captain remained slumped against the wall, his chest rising faintly, a ghost of the man who'd helmed the flight just an hour ago. Marcus's eyes flicked to him for a heartbeat, long enough to register the stakes, before returning to the controls. "Fuel's at 30%, Ryan said, his voice tight as he scanned the gauges. "We've got maybe 40 minutes before we're running on fumes." Marcus nodded, his mind racing through calculations. Distance to Seattle-Tacoma, wind speed the storm's trailing edge. His fingers moved with a quiet precision, tweaking the heading to shave seconds off their descent. Then a sharp jolt rocked the plane, a grinding whine cutting through the cockpit like a blade. "What the hell was that?" Ryan's head snapped toward the engine readouts, his face paling as a red light flared to life. "Engine 1! It's surging! Power's dropping fast!" Marcus's jaw tightened, his pulse spiking, but his voice remained level. "Compensate with 2. Increase thrust. Now!" Ryan obeyed, his hands trembling as he adjusted the levers, the plane groaning under the strain. The aircraft tilted slightly, a sickening yaw that Marcus countered with a deft twist of the yoke, his years of experience distilled into muscle memory. He scanned the weather radar. Dark green swirls loomed ahead, a final gauntlet before clear skies. "We're not out of this yet," he muttered, more to himself than Ryan. "Seattle Tower, this is Flight 142, he said into the radio, his tone crisp despite the chaos. "Engine 1's failing. We're stable for now, but we need that runway clear and emergency crews ready." The tower's response crackled back, clipped and urgent. "Flight 142, runway 16L is yours. Fire and medical on standby. How's your approach?" Marcus glanced at the altimeter. 28,000 feet and falling. 20 minutes out, he replied. "We'll make it." He had to believe it, for the 100 souls behind him who didn't know how thin the thread of their survival had stretched. Ryan exhaled shakily, his eyes locked on Marcus. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he asked, a note of awe creeping into his voice. Marcus's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "More times than I'd like," he said, his focus unbroken as the plane steadied, the storm's grip loosening inch by inch. Back in the cockpit doorway, Jessica Carter stood frozen, her arms still crossed but her posture less defiant, her blue eyes wide as they tracked Marcus's every move. The sharp whine of the struggling engine had pierced through her earlier bravado, leaving her pale and silent, a spectator to a drama she couldn't comprehend. Beside her, Daniel Morales gripped the frame, his knuckles white, his gaze shifting between Marcus and the flashing controls with a mix of fear and admiration. The plane steadied under Marcus's hands, the yaw corrected, but the air thrummed with the uneven pulse of a single engine, pushing them forward. "He's got it," Daniel whispered, almost to himself, his voice trembling with relief. Jessica's lips parted, a retort dying on her tongue as the reality of their peril sank in. Her prejudice had no place here, not when survival hung on the man she'd scorned. Marcus didn't see them. His world was the cockpit, the instruments, the sky. He adjusted the trim, his fingers gliding over the controls with a dancer's grace, coaxing the plane into a shallow descent. "Start the emergency checklist," he told Ryan, his voice a steady anchor. Ryan fumbled with the clipboard, his hands steadier now as he read off items. Fuel cross-feed, engine shutdown procedures, his trust in Marcus growing with every command. The radio crackled again. "Flight 142, you're cleared for direct approach. Winds at 10 knots northeast. Update your status." Marcus responded without hesitation. "Engine 1's out, but we're holding steady at 20,000 feet. 15 minutes to touchdown." The tower's voice softened, a rare note of humanity breaking through. Good work, 142. We've got you covered. The plane's descent smoothed, the storm's last tendrils fading into a distant rumble, and Marcus allowed himself a single deep breath. His mind flashed to his daughter, Aaliyah, her bright eyes and fierce spirit, 12 years old and already dreaming of wings. If he didn't make it, she'd hear this story from strangers, not him. He pushed the thought away, his focus narrowing to the runway coordinates glowing on the screen. Ryan glanced at him, sweat streaking his face. "You're unreal, man," he said, a shaky laugh escaping. "I'd have lost it without you." Marcus met his gaze briefly, a quiet strength in his eyes. "We're not down yet," he replied. "Keep it together. We finish this together." Jessica shifted, her heels scraping the floor, and Marcus caught her reflection in the glass. Haunted, stripped of her earlier venom. Beyond the door, the passengers' muffled prayers and shouts filtered through, Evelyn Harper's voice rising in a fervent plea. The cockpit trembled faintly, the lone engine straining, but Marcus held the course, his hands unwavering. He could feel the weight of their lives, a burden he'd carried before, and he knew this moment, engine failing, storm receding, would echo far beyond the cabin, a truth ready to break free the second they touched the ground. The cabin of Flight 142 vibrated with a tense, electric hum as Marcus Washington guided the plane through its descent, the single-engine's strained roar a constant undercurrent to the fading storm. In the first-class section, the passengers gripped their armrests, their faces a gallery of fear and fragile hope, their prayers and murmurs weaving a fragile tapestry of sound. Evelyn Harper sat near the back, her silver hair disheveled, her phone clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The video she'd started recording at the gate, capturing Jessica Carter's sneering disdain, hadn't stopped rolling, and now it bore witness to a drama far greater than she'd imagined. As the plane steadied, her thumb hovered over the upload button, a spark of resolve igniting in her chest. She glanced at her husband, George, who nodded grimly, his weathered hand resting on hers. "People need to see this," she whispered, and with a tap, the footage streamed into the digital ether, tag number Flight 142 Truth. Within minutes, the internet erupted. Evelyn's video, grainy but unmistakable, spread across Twitter like wildfire, a montage of Jessica's contempt juxtaposed against the unfolding crisis. "Flight attendant mocks black passenger, now he's saving the plane," one tweet blared, racking up thousands of retweets. Another clipped the moment Jessica sneered about charity raffles, paired with a shaky shot of Marcus entering the cockpit. Captioned, "Heroes don't need your approval." The cabin remained oblivious to the storm brewing online, but the energy shifted as passengers sensed the tide turning. Evelyn's voice rose above the murmurs, firm despite her age. "That man's a pilot, a real one," she told the young mother across the aisle, who clutched her toddler tighter, tears streaking her face. "He's getting us down alive." Near the galley, Daniel Morales hovered, his kind eyes darting toward the cockpit door, where Marcus's silhouette was just visible through the glass. He'd overheard passengers whispering about the video, their phones buzzing with notifications despite the spotty in-flight Wi-Fi. "It's gone viral," a teenage girl muttered to her seatmate, showing her screen. Jessica's face frozen mid-scowl, now a meme of bigotry laid bare. Daniel's stomach twisted. He'd known Jessica's attitude was poison, but seeing it exposed like this felt like a reckoning. He glanced at Jessica, who stood rigid near the galley, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the floor. She hadn't spoken since Marcus took control, her earlier venom replaced by a brittle silence. But her fingers twitched as if sensing the noose tightening around her. The passengers' voices grew louder, a mix of gratitude and outrage, some shouting toward the cockpit, "You've got this, man!" A lifeline of trust Marcus couldn't hear, but could feel, pressing him forward as the runway loomed closer. The plane's descent sharpened, the faint outline of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport flickering into view through the cockpit window, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Inside the cabin, the viral storm raged on, unseen but palpable, as passengers clung to their phones, their screens lighting up with notifications. Richard Hensley, the businessman who'd buried himself in his laptop earlier, finally set it aside, his fingers scrolling through Twitter with a furrowed brow. The video's reach had exploded. Hundreds of thousands of views, hashtags like Number Justice for Marcus, trending alongside furious condemnations of Jessica's behavior. Unbelievable, he muttered, his voice thick with guilt as he glanced toward the cockpit, where Marcus's steady hands held their fate. The shame of his earlier silence gnawed at him, a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. Evelyn Harper's resolve hardened as she watched the numbers climb. Likes, shares, retweets, a digital roar echoing her outrage. She leaned toward George, her voice trembling with emotion. That girl thought she could humiliate him, and now the world knows he's a hero. George squeezed her hand, his eyes misty. He's more than that. He's saving us all. Their words carried, sparking a ripple of nods and murmurs among nearby passengers, a growing tide of awe and anger. The young mother wiped her tears, whispering to her toddler, "See, baby? That man's a pilot, just like in your books." The child's wide eyes followed her gaze toward the cockpit, a tiny hand waving as if Marcus could see. Jessica felt the shift, a cold dread creeping up her spine as the cabin's energy turned against her. She caught snippets of conversation. "She's done for. Serves her right." And her nails dug into her palms, her breath shallow and sharp. Daniel approached her cautiously, his voice low. "They're talking about the video, Jess. It's everywhere." She snapped her head toward him, her eyes blazing with a mix of defiance and fear. "I don't care what they think," she hissed, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. She glanced at the cockpit, where Marcus's silhouette moved with quiet precision, and for the first time, a shadow of doubt flickered across her face. Had she misjudged him so completely that it would cost her everything? Beyond the cabin, Marcus's world remained the controls, the runway, the ticking clock. But back home in Atlanta, his daughter Aaliyah sat glued to the TV, her small hands clasped tightly as breaking news flashed across the screen. Passenger pilot takes over failing flight. Tears welled in her eyes, a mix of terror and pride as she dialed his phone, her voice breaking through the voicemail. "Dad, it's me. I saw it all. You're amazing. Please come home safe." The message waited, unheard, as Marcus guided the plane closer to the ground, the truth of his courage rippling outward, a wave that would crash upon them all the moment the wheels touched down. The sky over Seattle-Tacoma International Airport darkened into a bruised purple, streaks of rain slashing against the cockpit windows as Marcus Washington guided Flight 142 toward the runway. The lone engine's roar filled the small space, a ragged pulse that strained against the silence of its failed twin, while warning lights flickered like dying embers across the panel. Marcus's hands gripped the yoke, his knuckles taut but steady, his eyes locked on the faint glow of runway 16L cutting through the storm. Beside him, Ryan Taylor called out altitudes in a voice tight with focus. 10,000 feet, descending. His earlier panic tempered by Marcus's unshakable calm. The captain remained slumped against the wall, his shallow breaths a faint counterpoint to the chaos, a reminder of why Marcus sat in his place. "Gear down," Marcus commanded, his tone clipped as he adjusted the throttle, compensating for a sudden gust that rocked the plane sideways. Ryan flipped the switches, the whine of hydraulics piercing the tension as the landing gear deployed with a heavy thud. The aircraft shuddered, the single engine whining louder, and Marcus's jaw clenched as a new alert flared, power fluctuating dangerously close to failure. "Come on, hold together," he muttered, his fingers dancing over the controls, coaxing every ounce of life from the machine. The radio crackled, Seattle Tower's voice steady but urgent. "Flight 142, you're on final approach. Winds 15 knots, gusting. Emergency cruise in position." Marcus nodded to himself, his pulse a metronome of resolve. "Roger that. 5 miles out." Outside, the runway lights sharpened into focus, a lifeline shimmering through the rain-soaked dusk. But the plane bucked again, the engine's pitch rising into a scream. "It's surging!" Ryan shouted, his hands hovering over the panel, panic creeping back into his eyes. Marcus didn't flinch. He eased the yoke, leveling the wings with a precision honed by years aloft. "We've got enough," he said, his voice a steel thread. "Brace for impact, just in case." Ryan relayed the order through the intercom, his words trembling but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for an emergency landing. Follow the crew's instructions. We're almost there." In the cabin, muffled cries rose, Evelyn Harper clutching George's hand, the young mother hushing her toddler with a whispered prayer. Marcus's world narrowed to the runway, the altimeter ticking down. 500 feet, 400, 300. Rain hammered the windshield, blurring the lights into a kaleidoscope, but he held the course, his breath steady even as the engine sputtered, a final desperate gasp echoing through the cockpit. 100 feet, Ryan called, his voice hoarse. 40, 30. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a jolt, a grinding screech as Marcus deployed the spoilers and thrust reversers, the plane's momentum fighting his control. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the cabin erupted in cheers, a tidal wave of relief crashing through the walls. The plane slowed to a halt on the rain-slicked tarmac of Seattle-Tacoma, its single engine coughing into silence as Marcus Washington powered down the systems with methodical calm. The cockpit trembled faintly, a final echo of the ordeal, and Marcus leaned back in the captain's seat, his hands resting on the yoke as the adrenaline ebbed from his veins. Ryan Taylor slumped beside him, his headset dangling around his neck, sweat streaking his pale face. "We made it," he rasped, a shaky laugh breaking through his exhaustion. You're incredible." Marcus turned to him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We made it," he corrected, clapping Ryan's shoulder. "Good work keeping it together." Ryan shook his head, disbelief and gratitude warring in his eyes, then reached out to shake Marcus's hand, a firm grip sealing their shared triumph. Beyond the cockpit door, the cabin buzzed with a chaotic symphony of relief, cheers, sobs, and fervent thank yous spilling from the passengers as they unbuckled their belts. Evelyn Harper stood, her silver hair wild, tears streaming down her cheeks as she hugged George, whispering, "He did it. He really did it." The young mother clutched her toddler, rocking him gently, her voice choked with emotion as she murmured, "We're safe, baby. We're safe." Daniel Morales moved through the aisle, his kind eyes shining with pride as he glanced toward the cockpit, while Jessica Carter lingered near the galley, her arms wrapped around herself, her face a mask of pale shock. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, her earlier venom drowned by the thunderous applause echoing through the plane. Marcus rose from the seat, stretching his stiff limbs, and caught his reflection in the cockpit glass. Tired but resolute, a man who'd just defied the odds. He glanced at the captain, now stirring faintly as emergency crews swarmed the tarmac outside, their red lights flashing through the rain. "They'll take care of him," Ryan said, following his gaze, and Marcus nodded, a quiet relief settling in. The cockpit door swung open, and a wave of gratitude crashed over him, passengers craning their necks, some standing on seats, all desperate to see the man who'd saved them. "Thank you," a voice shouted, followed by another. "God bless you." The sound swelled, a roar of appreciation that shook the walls, and Marcus stepped forward, his broad frame filling the doorway. Jessica's eyes met his, a fleeting, haunted glance before she looked away, her hands trembling as she gripped the galley counter. Daniel nudged her gently, his voice low. "He's the real deal, Jess. You saw it." She didn't respond, her silence louder than any words, as Marcus raised a hand to quiet the crowd, his presence commanding even in exhaustion. The runway lights glowed outside, a testament to their survival. But Marcus knew this landing was just the beginning. A storm of reckoning waited, one that would demand answers from them all. The rain had softened to a drizzle as Flight 142 sat motionless on the tarmac of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, its cabin still humming with the aftershocks of survival. Emergency crews swarmed outside, their red lights pulsing through the windows, while medics rushed the unconscious captain away on a stretcher, his faint groans lost in the clamor. Marcus Washington stepped off the jet bridge into a sea of grateful faces, his suit rumpled, his broad shoulders heavy with exhaustion but held high. Passengers spilled out behind him, their voices a chaotic swell of relief and awe. Evelyn Harper clutching George's arm, the young mother cradling her toddler, Richard Hensley trailing with a sheepish nod. They surrounded Marcus, hands outstretched, words tumbling over each other. You saved us. A real hero. The air crackled with their gratitude. A tide Marcus met with a quiet nod. His dark eyes steady but distant, still processing the weight of what he'd done. Jessica Carter emerged last, her heels clicking unevenly on the metal stairs, her pristine uniform now creased and damp. She lingered at the edge of the crowd, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her blonde hair falling loose from its bun. The passengers' cheers faded into a murmur as eyes turned toward her. Recognition, sparking from Evelyn's viral video, now burned into their minds. That's her, a voice hissed. Richard, his guilt morphing into accusation. The one who treated him like dirt. Jessica flinched, her pale face tightening, but she didn't retreat. Daniel Morales stepped beside her, his kind eyes conflicted, whispering, You can't run from this, Jess. She shot him a glare, her lips trembling, but the defiance in her stance wavered as Marcus turned, his gaze locking onto hers. The crowd parted instinctively, a silent corridor forming between them, the drizzle pattering softly on the jet bridge's roof. Jessica's breath hitched, her hands clenching into fists as she took a hesitant step forward. Mr. Washington, she began, her voice a brittle thread, barely audible over the hum of distant engines. I'm sorry. The words stumbled out, raw and unsteady, her eyes darting to the ground then back to him, searching for something. Absolution, perhaps, or a shield from the storm she'd unleashed. Marcus stood still, his expression unreadable, the weight of her earlier scorn hanging between them like a tangible force. He remembered her sneer, the water sloshed carelessly on his tray, the venom of her charity raffle jab, each a cut now laid bare by the truth of his actions. Evelyn broke the silence, her voice trembling with emotion as she approached Marcus, ignoring Jessica entirely. You saved my George, she said, tears streaking her wrinkled cheeks. He's got a bad heart. Without you, I'd have lost him. She gripped Marcus's hand, her gratitude a lifeline, and he squeezed back gently, his resolve softening. But Jessica remained, a shadow in the rain, waiting for his response. Marcus released Evelyn's hand, his gaze shifting back to Jessica Carter, who stood trembling under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. The drizzle clung to her hair, streaking mascara down her cheeks and stripping away the polished facade she'd worn like armor. Her apology hung in the air, fragile and incomplete, and Marcus felt the eyes of the passengers boring into him. Evelyn's tearful gratitude, Richard's newfound boldness, the young mother's quiet awe. They waited, a jury of survivors, for his judgment. He took a step closer, the jet bridge creaking beneath his weight, and the space between him and Jessica seemed to shrink, charged with the unspoken history of her contempt and his triumph. Thank you for your apology, Jessica, Marcus said, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. I accept it. A ripple of surprise passed through the onlookers. Evelyn's brow furrowed, Richard's jaw tightened, but Marcus wasn't finished. But this isn't just about me. He paused, letting the words settle, his eyes steady on hers. The way you acted, it's bigger than one flight, one passenger. It's how you see people, how you judge them before they've even had a chance to prove who they are. Up there at 35,000 feet, it didn't matter what you thought of me. What mattered was what I could do. His tone was measured, not cruel, but each syllable landed like a stone, peeling back the layers of her prejudice for all to see. Jessica's face crumpled, a sob catching in her throat as she hugged herself tighter, the rain mixing with tears she couldn't hide. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice breaking. I was wrong, so wrong. The confession spilled out, raw and jagged, and for a moment, Marcus saw not the sneering flight attendant, but a woman unraveling under the weight of her own reckoning. He didn't soften, but he didn't strike either. He let her words hang, a mirror she couldn't escape. Daniel stepped forward, resting a hand on her shoulder, his expression torn between pity and resolve. You saw what he did, Jess, he said quietly. That's what matters now. The crowd stirred, some nodding, others whispering, as Marcus turned away, his message delivered. Evelyn clasped his arm again, her voice fierce. "You're a better man than she deserves," she said, and Marcus offered a small, weary smile. "Maybe," he replied, "but it's not about deserving. It's about doing right." He moved toward the terminal, the passengers parting like a tide, their applause rising anew. Jessica sank against the jet bridge railing, her sobs muffled by the rain, while beyond the glass doors the world waited. Reporters, airline officials, a storm of consequences ready to break. Marcus felt it coming, a weight heavier than the plane he'd landed. But he walked on, knowing this confrontation was only the first step toward the reckoning ahead. The morning sun pierced through the gray clouds over Seattle, casting a pale glow across the sleek glass facade of the airline's headquarters near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Marcus Washington stepped out of a taxi, his suit freshly pressed but his eyes shadowed with fatigue from a sleepless night. The events of Flight 142 replayed in his mind. The failing engine, the rain-slicked runway, Jessica's tearful apology. Each moment a thread in a tapestry, now unraveling across the world. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, notifications piling up from news alerts and messages. But he silenced it with a sigh, steeling himself for what awaited inside. The terminal buzz had followed him here, reporters already clustering near the entrance, their cameras flashing as he approached, a reluctant hero thrust into the spotlight. Inside the lobby, the air was cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous day. A young receptionist looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Washington," she stammered, "they're waiting for you upstairs." She gestured toward the elevators, her voice tinged with awe, and Marcus nodded, his broad frame moving with a quiet purpose. The ride to the top floor was silent, the hum of the machinery a faint echo of the plane's engines. And when the doors slid open, he was greeted by Ellen Brooks, the airline's CEO, her crisp blazer and sharp gaze exuding authority. "Mr. Washington," she said, extending a hand, her tone warm but measured. "I'm Ellen Brooks. What you did yesterday was extraordinary. On behalf of the airline, thank you for saving lives and sparing us a disaster." Marcus shook her hand, his grip firm but his expression guarded. "I'm glad I could help," he replied, his voice steady. "The co-pilot, Ryan, and the crew deserve credit too." Ellen nodded, leading him into a sleek conference room where a handful of executives waited, their faces a mix of gratitude and unease. On the table, a tablet streamed live coverage. Evelyn Harper's video had hit millions of views, headlines screaming, "Pilot passenger saves, flight after flight attendants, racism exposed." Ellen gestured to a chair. "Please sit. We've seen the footage. Jessica Carter's been terminated, effective immediately. Her actions were indefensible, and we're taking full responsibility." Marcus sat, his jaw tightening as he recalled her sneering face, now a viral symbol of bigotry, undone. Ellen leaned forward, her hands clasped. "We'd like to offer you a role, senior pilot and diversity consultant. You'd fly, but also help us reshape our culture. This incident, it's a wake-up call." Marcus's brow furrowed. The offer was tempting, a chance to wield influence, but his heart still belonged to the cockpit, not the boardroom. Before he could respond, Daniel Morales slipped into the room, his uniform crisp, his eyes hesitant but resolute. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "I need to say something. About Jessica." Daniel Morales stood awkwardly in the conference room, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze flickering between Marcus Washington and Ellen Brooks. The executives shifted in their seats, the air thickening with anticipation as Daniel cleared his throat. "I've worked with Jessica for years," he began, his voice low but steady. "She's always had an edge, but I reported her attitude months ago. Nothing happened. Yesterday, when she treated you like that, I should have stepped in sooner. I'm sorry." His eyes met Marcus's, a quiet plea for understanding, and Marcus nodded slightly, a flicker of respect softening his features. "You did what you could when it mattered," he said. "That's enough." Ellen's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line as she jotted a note on her tablet. "We'll address that oversight, Daniel," she said curtly. "This won't be swept under the rug again." She turned back to Marcus, her tone softening. "Your story's everywhere, TV, social media, even calls from the FAA. We're launching mandatory diversity training next week, inspired by your suggestion on the jet bridge. But we need you, Marcus, not just as a pilot, but as a voice. What do you say?" Marcus leaned back, the weight of the offer pressing against his chest. He thought of Aaliyah, his daughter, her voice trembling on that unheard voicemail, and the countless others who'd face what he had without a chance to prove themselves. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "But I'm a flyer first. Any role I take, I need to keep my wings." Ellen nodded, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "Fair enough. We'll tailor it. Senior pilot with a consultancy hat. You'll mentor, fly, and help us rebuild trust." She paused, glancing at the tablet as a new headline flashed. "Airline fires attendant, offers hero pilot top role." The room buzzed with murmurs, the executives exchanging looks of cautious optimism. Marcus felt the shift, a door opening to something bigger than himself. But his mind drifted to the quiet hotel room waiting for him, a sanctuary from the storm of fame he hadn't sought. "I just want to get home to my family," he said, his voice softer now. "Can we finalize this later?" "Of course," Ellen replied, rising to shake his hand again. "Take your time. You've earned it." As Marcus stood, Daniel approached, his expression earnest. "What you did up there, it's changed things. For me, for the crew." "Thank you." Marcus clapped his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement, then turned toward the door. Outside, the reporters surged, their shouts a distant roar. "Mr. Washington, what's next?" But he kept walking, the weight of their questions a prelude to the platform he'd soon wield. In Atlanta, Aaliyah watched the news, her pride swelling, unaware her father's quiet resolve was already shaping a future where wings wouldn't come with a color line. The Chicago skyline glittered under a crisp autumn sky, its towering spires framing the bustling convention center, where the National Aviation Conference hummed with energy. 3 months had passed since Marcus Washington's heroics on Flight 142, and the world hadn't let him fade into quiet obscurity. He stood backstage adjusting his tie, the murmur of the crowd filtering through the heavy curtains, a sea of pilots, industry leaders, and reporters eager to hear from the man whose story had ignited a reckoning. His new role with the airline, senior pilot and diversity consultant, had thrust him into a spotlight he'd never sought. But today he'd chosen to step into it fully, to speak not just for himself, but for those who'd been silenced by the same biases he'd faced. His phone buzzed with a text from Aaliyah. "You've got this, Dad. Show them." He smiled, her fierce spirit steadying his nerves. On stage, the lights blazed as the moderator introduced him, her voice booming through the hall. "Please welcome Marcus Washington, the pilot who saved Flight 142 and sparked a movement for change in aviation." Applause thundered, a wave that carried Marcus forward as he stepped into view, his broad frame commanding the podium. Below, Aaliyah sat in the front row, her 12-year-old eyes shining with pride, her hands clasped tightly. Marcus took a breath, the weight of her gaze grounding him, and began. "When I boarded that flight in Atlanta, I was just another passenger," he said, his voice steady and resonant. "But what happened up there wasn't just about a plane in crisis. It was about what we carry with us every day. Assumptions, judgments, the things that keep us from seeing each other clearly." He paused, letting the words settle. The crowd hushed and attentive. "I've flown for over a decade, faced storms and mechanical failures. But the hardest turbulence has always been the kind you can't see. The doubt, the sneers, the doors closed because of my skin." His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Aaliyah, who nodded, a silent echo of her own struggles with schoolyard bullies. "That day, a flight attendant, Jessica Carter, saw me as less than I am. But when the captain fell, when the engine failed, it wasn't about what she thought. It was about what I could do." Murmurs rippled through the audience, a mix of awe and discomfort, as Marcus's story laid bare a truth they couldn't ignore. He gripped the podium, his voice rising. "We can't keep flying blind to this. Aviation isn't just about wings. It's about who gets to wear them." Backstage, a figure lingered in the shadows, her blonde hair catching the dim light. Jessica Carter, uninvited but drawn by a pull she couldn't name, her face pale as Marcus's words cut through the air like a blade. The crowd leaned forward, hanging on Marcus Washington's every word as his voice filled the convention hall, a steady force cutting through the haze of privilege and denial. Change doesn't come from silence, he continued, his tone sharpening with resolve. It comes when we stand up, when we challenge what's wrong, not just for ourselves but for the next generation. He gestured toward Aaliyah, her small frame dwarfed by the sea of adults, yet her presence a beacon in his eyes. My daughter dreams of flying, and I'll be damned if she faces the same walls I did. This industry, our industry, needs to be a place where talent, not bias, decides who soars. Applause erupted, a rolling thunder that shook the room, Aaliyah clapping hardest of all, her cheeks flushed with pride and defiance. Jessica Carter shrank deeper into the shadows backstage, her hands twisting the strap of her purse, her breath shallow as Marcus's words pierced her. She'd come on impulse, drawn by whispers of his speech, but now each sentence felt like a mirror held to her soul. The memory of Flight 142 flashed, her sneering charity raffle quip, the engine's failing scream, Marcus's steady hands saving them all, and shame burned in her chest, hot and unrelenting. She'd lost her job, her reputation, but this was worse. Facing the man she'd wronged, not as a victim, but as a titan reshaping the world she'd once ruled. The crowd's cheers swelled and she flinched, her resolve teetering between flight and confrontation. Marcus stepped back from the podium, the applause washing over him, but his gaze caught a flicker of movement, a familiar blonde figure hovering near the wings, his brow furrowed, recognition sparking, and the room seemed to fade as their eyes met across the distance. Jessica froze, her lips parting. Then she stepped forward, a hesitant silhouette against the stage lights. The moderator moved to close the session, but Jessica raised a hand, her voice trembling but clear. Wait, I need to say something. The crowd hushed, a ripple of confusion spreading as she climbed the steps, her heels clicking like a countdown. Marcus stood still, his expression unreadable, Aaliyah's eyes narrowing as she gripped her seat. I'm Jessica Carter, she said, her voice cracking as she faced the audience. Then Marcus. I was on that flight. I treated this man, Mr. Washington, like he didn't belong, and I was wrong. Tears welled, streaking her face, but she pressed on. I've spent months facing what I did, learning from it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm here to say I've changed. Because of him. The room held its breath, Marcus's gaze steady, weighing her words. This wasn't the end, he knew, just a step towards something greater, a reckoning that would echo beyond this stage, into the skies he'd fought to claim for all. 5 years had spun the world forward since Marcus Washington landed Flight 142, and on a crisp spring morning in 2030, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport buzzed with a different kind of energy. The tarmac gleamed under the sun, lined with a small crowd gathered for a ceremony that bore Marcus's indelible mark, a ribbon cutting for the Washington Wing Scholarship, a program he'd built from the ashes of that fateful flight to lift young pilots from underrepresented backgrounds into the sky. Marcus stood at the podium, his suit sharp, his hair flecked with gray, but his presence as commanding as ever. Beside him, Aaliyah, now 17, stood tall in a flight academy uniform, her dark eyes fierce with the promise of her first solo flight just weeks away. The crowd, airline staff, scholarship recipients, reporters, watched in reverent silence as Marcus adjusted the mic, his voice steady but warm. This isn't about me, he began. It's about them, the dreamers who deserve a chance to soar. The scholarship's first cohort flanked him, a tapestry of faces reflecting the diversity he'd fought for. Sofia Alvarez, a Latina teen with a grin that lit the runway, clutched a flight log. Jamal Carter, a young black man, stood proud beside her, his cap tilted with swagger. Marcus's gaze swept over them, pride swelling in his chest. 5 years ago, I was just a passenger who stepped up, he said. But what happened on that plane wasn't the end. It was the beginning. We've trained over 50 pilots here, and today we send our first class into the air. Applause broke out, a rolling wave, and Aaliyah squeezed his arm, whispering, You did this, Dad. He smiled, but his eyes caught a figure at the crowd's edge. Jessica Carter, her blonde hair shorter now, her face etched with lines of a life reshaped. She'd approached him earlier, before the ceremony, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Washington, I'm not here to intrude," she'd said, clutching a folder. "I've been working, diversity training, speaking gigs, trying to undo what I was. I wanted you to know." Marcus had studied her, seeing not the sneering flight attendant of old, but a woman who'd walked through fire to find redemption. "You're here," he'd replied simply. "That's enough." Now as he spoke to the crowd, she lingered, her presence a quiet testament to the ripples of that day. The ribbon stretched across the podium, scissors glinting in Sophia's hands, and Marcus stepped back, letting the kids take center stage. "This is their sky now," he said, his voice thick with emotion, and the crowd cheered as Sophia snipped the ribbon, a plane roaring overhead in salute. The plane's engines faded into a distant hum as Sofia Alvarez stepped back from the ribbon, her hands trembling with excitement, the red fabric fluttering to the tarmac like a fallen banner of old barriers. Marcus Washington watched, his heart pounding with a quiet joy as the scholarship recipients beamed, their futures unfurling like the clear sky above Seattle-Tacoma. Aaliyah nudged him, her flight jacket crisp, and whispered, "I'm next, Dad." "Solo next week." He pulled her close, pride choking his voice. "You'll own that sky," he murmured, and she grinned, the same fierce spark he'd seen at 12 now, blazing toward her own wings. The crowd's applause softened, and Marcus scanned their faces, airline staff who'd embraced his vision, mentors who'd trained these kids, and there, at the edge, Jessica Carter, her eyes glistening with something deeper than regret. She stepped forward as the ceremony wound down, the crowd parting instinctively, her folder now tucked under her arm. "Mr. Washington," she said louder this time, drawing every gaze, "can I speak?" Marcus nodded, stepping aside, and she faced the audience, her voice trembling but resolute. "5 years ago, I was the flight attendant on Flight 142. I judged this man, wrongly, cruelly, and he saved us anyway. I lost everything that day, deservedly, but he gave me a chance to rebuild by showing me what courage looks like." Tears streaked her face, but she stood taller. "I'm a diversity consultant now because of him. I tell my story, our story, to stop others from making my mistakes." A hush fell, broken only by the wind, and Marcus felt the weight of her words, a bridge built from the wreckage of that flight. He moved toward her, extending a hand, and she took it, their grip firm, a silent pact forged in shared redemption. "Jessica," he said loud enough for all to hear, "the past doesn't define us. It's what we do with it. You're proof of that." The crowd erupted, a roar of approval, and Aaliyah joined them, her applause fierce as she shouted, "That's my dad!" Across the tarmac, Sophia climbed into a small training plane, the engine roaring to life, and Marcus watched as she taxied out, her silhouette rising against the horizon. A Latina girl claiming the sky he'd fought to open. The plane lifted off, a speck of hope soaring into the blue, and Marcus felt the final piece click into place. As the crowd dispersed, he stood with Aaliyah, Jessica beside them, the three of them gazing upward. "This is it," he said softly, the weight of 5 years lifting, "a sky for everyone." Sophia's plane banked gracefully, a symbol of all they'd built, and Marcus smiled, peace settling deep in his bones. A legacy not just of survival, but of a world remade, one flight at a time.